Today is all about flowers. For many folks in the Northern Hemisphere right now, it is just about wildflower season, which can be a fun field day for a photographer. And even if it isn't wildflower season for you, most places around the world have flowers, at least in one form or another. Flowers are beautiful, so they're wonderful to photograph, and they're also often a cooperative companion in your photography learning journey. And I'll get back to that in just a moment. In this video, in honor of wildflower season, I want to share with you some of my tips for photographing flowers to get the results that you'd like. There will be some discussion of creativity and artistry, and I will also share technical guidance today. And if you're just starting out, some of that technical guidance may seem like a foreign language, but don't despair. My Basics of Photography course is now free for all of my viewers. I will add a link to that course in the description of this video. In that 4-hour-long course, I take you step by step through the foundations of photography so that you can learn all about the terminology and the concepts. Or if you've already taken that course and you need something to practice your new photography knowledge on, or if you're brushing up on your photography skills after a hiatus. Like I said, wildflowers are a great thing to practice with. And I should say that a lot, or even most of what I'll discuss today will apply to any photography gear that you might be using, even if you're just using the camera on your phone. Throughout this video, you will see photos that I have captured over the last many years. And by seeing those, you can get some ideas of what you like and maybe what you don't like, the colors that you're drawn to, and even get ideas for different compositions. And you can take those ideas and add your own individuality to them. Let's begin with a discussion on general subject matter. Flowers. I wonder what you think of when I say wildflower photography. Do you think of an entire field of flowers, or do you picture just one flower in the image? I've found that over the last decade plus of doing this and talking to other photographers and answering their questions and looking at their photos, a situation like wildflower photography can lend itself to tunnel vision. Like, the photographer knows that they are going to take their camera out to visit something specific. In this case, let's say a field of flowers. And they can imagine an image, and then they do capture that image with slight variations over and over, sometimes to the exclusion of everything else. So my first tip is to vary your photos in terms of subject matter. Yes, you're capturing wildflowers, but see how many completely different ways you can capture a field of flowers. Maybe you capture the wider field a few different ways. Then you get down into the weeds, so to speak, and capture individual flowers or groups of flowers. We'll talk more about all of that in just a minute. In fact, I particularly like varying my photography in this way because once I'm home and I'm printing the images out, or I'm posting a series of them on social media, I can share the big and the small, the landscape of flowers and the close-up detail. It tells the story of the place, and it allows the viewer to immerse themselves the way you immersed yourself while capturing the photos. How to vary the photos is now the question, right? Let's discuss composition a little bit. My simplest and probably most impactful tip when it comes to composition is to, again, vary it. If you are capturing the broader field of flowers, you may try to put the horizon line right in the middle of the frame. But also think about, say, the rule of thirds, where you divide the photo up into a grid and move that horizon to the upper third line or the lower third line, or even stray from those. You can end up with a more visually interesting composition that way. Similarly, if you are really focusing in on one flower, vary where that flower is in the frame. The middle might be great, but we can use the rule of thirds again to guide us to placing that flower in different spots around the frame to create more visual interest. And that gets you a better photo. Along with composition comes perspective and positioning. Are you standing at the edge of the field capturing all of your photos, or are you wading into the field? Are you standing up for some images and squatting down for others, really getting into it? Have you captured the flowers from ground level and then from up above and then straight down? All of those variations will give you more options when you get back to your computer and you're looking at the images at the end of the day. Another tip I have goes for any sort of outdoor photography. Pay attention to lighting and conditions. Generally, going out a little before sunrise or sticking around for sunset are going to provide you with the best, most magical lighting. Sometimes, though, we are where we are and we have to deal with midday or harsh sunlight. Embrace it. Of course, if you can, get out there early or stay late for the best lighting situations. Or even choose a day where there are some clouds in the sky, which will not only soften your light and maybe even make for a more interesting sunrise or sunset, but it will also add visual interest in the sky. Okay, let's get a bit technical here. Consider your depth of field. When capturing a broad landscape of flowers, your initial inclination is probably to achieve a deep depth of field where everything is in focus. That's great. But don't be afraid to create a shallower depth of field where only a portion of the field is in focus. Or with a single or groups of flowers, you might again vary that depth of field. Do you want a shallow depth of field? You can use a wide aperture and often achieve it, but if you don't have a very wide aperture available on your lens, or maybe you're using your phone, look around for a flower that is naturally separated from the others. That way you can isolate the subject by, physically isolating it, rather than by having it in focus while its immediate surroundings are blurred out. I've even gently kind of pushed down grasses and such around flowers to achieve that physical isolation. And here's an idea of a completely different kind. Use the flowers to create an atmosphere. With the introduction of people or man-made objects, you can show an additional sense of scale and perspective to those fields of flowers. Here's an example. In this editorial style photo shoot, I was immersed in a field of wildflowers in northern Arizona. While we're not seeing the details of any one particular flower here, we're seeing the environment and the atmosphere that they create, the colors. Nor do you see the ants that were crawling on my feet or the hundreds of plump, furry caterpillars that were clinging to every single plant stalk and stem. By the way, always be prepared and be careful. I really wished at the time that I had at least worn some galoshes or boots or something to protect my feet, but anyway, you could add a model or your pet, your kids, or your entire family to the scene. In this situation, there were ants and such crawling all over the flowers. I suppose I could have tried to get them off of this flower, but instead, I just included them. Or in this photo, it's arguable if the subject is the hummingbird or is the flower, but the two together definitely make this a better photo than if it was just one or the other. I have one tip on editing wildflower photography. Be careful of overdoing it. Increasing the saturation or the vibrancy a bit, boosting contrast, those are quite common for nature shots, right? But pay attention to the realism of the scene, or lack thereof. If you do want the photo to look like a real place rather than a digital render or something, keep an eye on your clarity and your contrast and your saturation. Remember that some detail will invariably be lost in highlights or in shadows. That's what the real world looks like. So you don't need to minimize every shadow. And conversely, if you saturate your image too much, you can lose detail in the colors. Now, editing is subjective, and we all have our own personal style. So if you like the results of having the contrast and clarity sliders pulled way over to the right, by all means do your thing. But my final word on this is to edit your images, and then step away for a bit. When you come back, you'll be better equipped to gauge the edits that you've done. You tend to notice things like the saturation being a little bit too much or a little bit too little. Okay, now that you have some ideas on what the photos will look like, let's talk a little bit about gear. You can really use any camera and lens, right? I've certainly captured flowers and nature in general with every single camera that I own and every single camera that I've used, including my phone's camera. So whatever you have, it will work. Don't feel like you need to go out and purchase anything in particular for this. However, I do have some tips for you. When you are capturing the entire field of flowers, your lens choice will really depend upon the situation. You might want a wide or ultra-wide lens, but it's certainly possible that a 35mm lens or a 50mm lens would be better suited to the field that you are standing in front of. So don't be afraid to experiment here. And one more thought, if you are using an ultra-wide lens because you want that entire field in the frame, remember that with ultra-wide, you have a lot of frame to fill. You might have all of those flowers in the field, in the photo, but you may also have a big strip of blank blue sky too, which can end up being a little bit boring in the image. So you may capture those images and vary your composition, but then zoom in or switch lenses to see what else you can capture, even if it means sacrificing some of the portions of the field of flowers. Now, for a single flower or a small group of flowers where that flower fills up a larger portion of the frame, I have more thoughts for you. One technical tip is this. If you're outside, it can get windy, and those wildflowers are going to move in the wind, so you will want to check your shutter speed. Assuming that you aren't going for any abstract or blurring effects, you will want to freeze the motion of the flower. It is fair game to help a bit by steadying the flower with your hand. Just be gentle to that happy little flower and watch for thorns and insects. No matter if you are steadying the flower or not, there's no one best shutter speed, and it's difficult for me to predict what you may need, considering the conditions, the focal length of your lens, and the features of your camera and lens. But I know sometimes that you just need a place to start. So start with a shutter speed of 1/60th and work from there. Capture your photo, review it, and even zoom in to make sure that you have a crisp image. If not, increase your shutter speed. Here's another tip. Get close. I recommend one of two approaches to get close to the flower subject, which will deliver slightly different results. The first approach is to get physically close to the flower. But all lenses have a minimum focusing distance, meaning how close you can get to the subject and still have the lens focus. Different lenses have different minimum focusing distances, and you'll have to work with yours. If you have it, you may want to use a macro lens. Some phone cameras even have macro capability. Macro is convenient to have because you have the freedom to get very, very close to your subject. I actually used an add-on macro lens to my phone's camera for this photo, which turned out kind of abstract. I love it. And I actually got a lot of use out of that camera, phone, and lens combination. However, with macro or near macro, there are a few things to watch out for. For the purposes of this exercise, I actually picked some flowers from my backyard and brought them in. We are in super close here with a 60mm macro lens. Since you're so close to your subject, you will need to watch your depth of field. With macro especially, being this close to the subject, your depth of field can be super shallow, possibly more shallow than you want. So you may wish to stop down that aperture quite a bit. In an aperture mode or aperture priority on your camera, this means that your shutter speed may slow down, introducing blur due to movement and wind, like we talked about earlier. So, ISO sensitivity adjustments can be your friend here. That way, you can set the shutter speed to your liking, that perfect aperture for the creative effect that you desire, and then effectively control the exposure with the ISO sensitivity. Again, I realize that this is getting technical here, and if this all sounds like Raymond reading poetry to you, check out that free course at the link down in the description, where I take you through the basics, including explanations of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO sensitivity.
A yellow flower, light in spirit, sings by itself for nobody. A golden spirit, light in emptiness, sings without a word by itself.
Not everyone has macro capabilities, or even if you do, you may not be able to get physically close to the flowers. So, my second approach to getting close to the flowers is to make it look like you are close to the flower. You can take advantage of telephoto capabilities, which can be easier to wrangle actually than using macro, especially when it comes to depth of field. I've switched to a 70 to 200 millimeter lens here. The camera is much further back away from the flowers, but we're using a longer focal length. Now, there will be a perspective difference between our macro shots and this telephoto shot. That is not distortion of the lens itself. That is a perspective difference between the two, simply because we're further away from the flower this time. You may or may not have a preference between the two perspectives, which may help you decide which gear to use when you head out to photograph wildflowers. But like with the macro lens, you'll still need to keep an eye on your depth of field and adjust your aperture accordingly. Okay, I've just mentioned macro lenses and telephoto lenses. Keep in mind that there are a lot of focal lengths and focal distances between my 60 millimeter macro and my 70 to 200 millimeter telephoto lens. This was just a sort of exercise in the extremes. Like I said earlier, I've captured nature and wildflowers with all sorts of different gear, from my phone to kit lenses to super telephoto lenses at 500 or 600 millimeters. Whatever gear I happen to have with me, when I see a beautiful wildflower, you can be sure I'm using it. Finally, one more technical tip and a small piece of gear for your collection: a neutral density filter. This was actually Raymond's input when I talked to him about this video. I don't use my neutral density filter all that often, but it is indispensable in certain situations. Earlier, we talked about increasing ISO sensitivity on your camera to assure that you're able to use faster shutter speeds to freeze any motion of your subject without having to compromise or change aperture, because it would affect your depth of field. What if your environment is so bright that you need a super fast shutter speed to keep exposure regulated while you still want a wide aperture for a shallow depth of field? Depending on your camera, you may be using its fastest shutter speed and the aperture you want, and the lowest ISO sensitivity that your camera supports, and the exposure is still too bright. Your photo is still overexposed. In this case, you need to make things darker. Of course, you could wait it out. You could shoot at a darker time of day, but a neutral density filter can be your friend here. A neutral density filter goes on your lens. Depending on your lens and your filter system, it may screw or clip onto the front of your lens, or it may slide into a holder towards where the lens meets the camera body. Either way, a neutral density filter quite simply makes things darker. It literally cuts the light that is getting to your camera's sensor. That way you can achieve that shallow depth of field that you want in bright conditions. These filters are relatively inexpensive. Mine is a variable neutral density filter that screws onto the front of the lens. All that said, if you are casually and only occasionally shooting flowers or other objects in bright conditions, more gear like a neutral density filter is not essential, but if you think you'll get some use out of it, it is not something that is going to take up a lot of space in your bag or any significant amount of weight. And mine is by no means the only option out there, but I will link to it in the description if you're interested. Just a few more creativity related ideas to throw out there for you. In this photo, you'll notice that the flower closest to the camera isn't the one in focus. You may have noticed this in some of my other photos too. Experiment with your focus. Maybe it's on the closest flower, but maybe it's on something further from the camera. Don't limit yourself by thinking that the lens on your camera can only be used for one type of photo. This photo was captured with a 20mm prime lens. You'd typically think of using this ultra-wide lens for a broader landscape of flowers, but I wanted to capture the detail on these pretty little purple flowers, so I got as close as my focusing distance would allow. And with cameras having such high pixel counts these days, I could have also cropped my image to get even closer to the flowers. Wildflowers are forgiving. I mentioned toward the beginning of this video that they are a great way to practice your skills as a beginner photographer, but they're also wonderful for experimentation for any photographer. All of these photos were captured with a new film camera that I had and a very old roll of film, hence the colors being a little bit off. I was getting to know the camera and getting back into film photography when I captured these. And while these photos aren't what you would typically see in, say, Arizona Highways magazine, I do love the results I got. So don't be afraid to do things that you wouldn't normally do. Try completely different compositions or use gear that you wouldn't normally think of using for flowers. See what you come up with. You might surprise yourself and even learn something in the process. All right, let's bring this thing home. In this video, I have certainly not provided you with an exhaustive list of all of the things that you can possibly think about and all of the gear that you can possibly use when photographing wildflowers. So I would love to see some discussion in the comments. Wildflowers are supremely popular to photograph, especially during the spring season. What are your best tips? What gear do you like to use? Share your thoughts with the rest of us. And one last thought of mine. This year, where I am, we aren't actually having the best wildflower season. It was a relatively dry winter. But that's not stopping me from getting out into nature with my camera. I mean, really almost nothing stops me from getting out into nature, but a lot of these same tips can be used with anything in nature. I particularly like all of the different grasses that I see and all of the different plants. So if it isn't a riotously colorful wildflower season where you are, you can still get out there and you can still practice these tips that I've shared today. Maybe I'll see you out there. So I do want to hear from you in the comments, and thank you for watching.